In the summer of 1985, Freddie Mercury stood on the stage at Wembley Stadium in front of 72,000 people and delivered what many would later call the greatest live performance in the history of rock music. 2 months earlier, he had released a solo album that had nearly destroyed the band he was performing with. Mr. Bad Guy, recorded in Munich and London across 1984 and released in April 1985, is the record that Queen's official history tends to handle with a degree of care that is itself a form of evidence. It is acknowledged. It is not examined. The reviews at the time were mixed. The commercial performance was disappointing by Freddie Mercury's standards. And the internal damage it caused to the relationships within Queen was, by the accounts of the people closest to the band during that period, more significant and more lasting than has ever been directly stated in public. This is the story of what actually happened in the years surrounding Mr. Bad Guy, what Freddie wanted, what the band feared, what nearly broke, and what ultimately held. And of why, in the summer of 1985, standing on that stage with Brian May and Roger Taylor and John Deacon behind him, Freddie Mercury understood something about the band he had nearly left that he had not fully understood before. To understand the circumstances that produced Mr. Bad Guy, you have to understand what Queen looked like internally in 1983 and 1984. The hot space period, the commercial disappointment of 1982, the critical dismissal of the band's dance-influenced direction had produced in all four members of Queen a period of genuine uncertainty about what the band was and where it was going. The Works album, released in February 1984, was a conscious attempt to return to something recognizably Queen after the hot space experiment, and it succeeded commercially and critically in ways that stabilized the band's position in the market. But the hot space period had opened something that the Works did not entirely close: the question of whether Queen, as a creative unit, was still the right container for what each of its members wanted to do. This question was not asked openly. It was not the subject of a band meeting or a formal discussion, but it existed in the specific way that important unasked questions exist between people who have known each other for more than a decade, as a presence in the room that everyone is aware of and nobody is directly addressing. Freddie Mercury's desire for a solo record was not a sudden impulse provoked by the hot space crisis. It had been building for several years, rooted in something more fundamental than dissatisfaction with Queen's direction. The root was musical range. Freddie's musical imagination operated across a wider spectrum than Queen's sound could always accommodate, not because Queen were limited, but because the specific sound that four people build together over more than a decade develops its own gravity, its own constraints, its own set of things it naturally is and is not. Freddie heard music in his head that required orchestration rather than guitar. That required the specific texture of synthesizers as a lead instrument rather than a supporting one. That required a certain kind of theatrical grandeur that Queen's rock framework sometimes made structurally difficult to achieve. He had been writing songs that Queen could not quite contain and filing them away, or reworking them to fit, or simply not pursuing them, because the band conversation was not the right one for what those songs needed. Mr. Bad Guy was the room where those songs could finally exist in their intended form. Brian May's response to Freddie's solo project was not, by his own account, simple hostility. He has described it in various interviews as a more complicated response than that: a mixture of genuine creative concern, personal hurt that was difficult to separate from the professional objection, and a specific fear about what the existence of a solo Freddie Mercury would mean for the continued existence of Queen. The creative concern was legitimate. If Freddie's energy and Freddie's songs were going elsewhere, what did that mean for the music Queen would make? The personal hurt was also legitimate. The four members of Queen had built something together across more than a decade that was the central fact of all their professional lives. And the idea of one of them deciding that the container was not enough was painful in ways that went beyond the purely commercial. And the fear about Queen's survival was not unreasonable, given the landscape bands that lost key members to solo careers in the early 1980s did not always survive the transition. Brian May understood all of this simultaneously and had difficulty in the period surrounding Mr. Bad Guy's recording, separating the different threads of his response into anything manageable. The recording of Mr. Bad Guy took place primarily in Munich, the city where Freddie had built his parallel private life, across the previous 5 years, and in London, across 1984 and into early 1985. Freddie worked with a group of musicians that did not include any member of Queen. The producer was Mac, the same producer who had worked on several Queen albums, a choice that provided a degree of continuity while making absolutely clear that this was not a Queen project. What Freddie made in those sessions was genuinely different from anything Queen had produced. Lush, orchestrated, synthesizer forward, with the theatrical grandeur he had been unable to fully deploy within the band's framework. The songs addressed subjects that Queen's collective identity had never quite reached: love in the specific and personal sense, loss in the intimate rather than the operatic sense, the private emotional world of a man in his late 30s who had spent his entire adult life performing rather than revealing. The making of the album was, by all accounts from people who were present, a liberation. Freddie was working without the need to negotiate, without the need to translate his vision into a collaborative vocabulary, without the weight of Queen's accumulated identity pressing on every decision. He was making exactly what he heard in his head. The experience of that freedom was both exhilarating and, in ways he did not fully process until later, clarifying. The freedom of the Mr. Bad Guy sessions had a quality that Freddie Mercury had not experienced since the earliest days of Queen, before the band's identity had solidified into something that carried its own obligations. He could move through musical ideas at the speed of his own thinking, rather than at the slower speed of a four-person conversation. He could make decisions about arrangements and textures and production choices without building consensus. He could follow the logic of a song wherever it led without needing to ask whether the destination was somewhere Queen could also go. These are not small things for a musician of Freddie's creative intensity, and the people who worked with him in the studio during this period have described a man operating with an energy and a focus that was different from his Queen recording mode, more internally directed, more exploratory, with less of the performance that even the collaborative creative process between close colleagues inevitably produces. He was also, during this period, managing the specific and private pressures of his life in Munich, the relationships, the social world, the specific combination of excess and loneliness that Munich represented in those years, and the music was absorbing some of what that life produced in him. Mr. Bad Guy sounds like a man who is being honest about something he has not been fully honest about before. That honesty is the album's greatest quality and, commercially, part of its difficulty. The internal Queen dynamics during the period of Mr. Bad Guy's production and release reached a level of tension that has been described by people close to the band with a consistency that makes the official reticence about it more rather than less significant. Brian May, in interviews given across the following decades, has never described this period in simple terms, has never reduced it to Freddie wanted to make a solo record and we disagreed and then Live Aid happened and everything was fine. The texture of what he describes is more complicated. A period of genuine uncertainty about the band's future, of conversations that were difficult to have because the stakes of having them honestly were very high, of a specific kind of creative loneliness that comes when one member of a long-standing collaborative unit signals, through action rather than words, that the unit may not be enough for them. Roger Taylor has been even less specific in public about this period, which is itself a form of evidence. Roger Taylor tends toward directness in interviews, and his unusual reticence about 1984 and early 1985 suggests a period he does not find easy to revisit in public. The band continued to function. The professional machinery kept moving. But the relationships inside the machinery were under a strain that the public record has consistently underrepresented. The decision to perform together at Live Aid in July 1985 was made while Mr. Bad Guy was already in the world, already reviewed, already being absorbed by the market with the mixed results that would define its commercial legacy. The decision was practical. In one sense, Live Aid was the event of the year, the largest simultaneous television audience in history, and the opportunity to perform on that stage was not something any band with Queen's profile could easily decline. But it was also something more than practical, and the people who were closest to the band during that period have suggested, in various carefully worded accounts, That the Live Aid conversation was also a conversation about whether Queen as a functioning unit still existed and still wanted to exist. The four men agreed to perform. They rehearsed. They arrived at Wembley. And what happened on that stage on the 13th of July, 1985 was not, in retrospect, simply a great performance. It was a demonstration to themselves as much as to the audience of what was possible when the four of them were in the same room at the same time doing the thing they had spent 15 years learning to do together. Freddie Mercury's Live Aid performance is usually described as a triumph of showmanship, as evidence of his extraordinary individual gifts as a performer, his ability to command an audience of any size, his specific and unrepeatable quality of presence. All of this is true. But what is less often noted is what the performance demonstrated to Freddie Mercury himself. For 12 months, he had been working without Queen, making music that was entirely his own, in rooms that operated by his rules, with musicians who were there to execute his vision rather than to negotiate with it. And that had been exhilarating, and it had been necessary, and it had produced a record he was genuinely proud of. And then he walked onto the Wembley stage with Brian May and Roger Taylor and John Deacon behind him. And what happened in the 21 minutes that followed was something that Mr. Bad Guy, for all its genuine qualities, could not produce. Not because the solo album was lesser music, but because the specific thing that happens when the four of them perform together, the specific quality of collective energy, the specific way Queen's music sounds when it is being played by the four people who invented it, was not available anywhere else. Freddie knew this before Live Aid. Live Aid made him feel it. Mr. Bad Guy was released in April 1985 and reached #1 in the United Kingdom, a commercial performance that sounds more impressive than it was in context. It did not match the chart success of Queen's best albums. It did not produce a single that became a permanent part of popular culture in the way that the best Queen singles had. Outside the United Kingdom, it performed modestly at best. The reviews acknowledged its ambition and Freddie's vocal performances, but were uncertain about the overall direction, uncertain in the specific way that reviews are uncertain when a piece of work is doing something the critic can recognize as intentional, but cannot quite categorize. For Freddie Mercury, who understood chart positions and critical reception with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had navigated the music industry for 15 years, the commercial outcome of Mr. Bad Guy was information. It told him something he had not fully known before he made the album. That the specific combination of his voice and his songs and the commercial infrastructure that Queen represented was not easily replicated outside of Queen. That what he had with the band was not simply four people making music together, but a specific and rare alchemy that had taken 15 years to produce and that did not travel. Brian May has spoken about the Mr. Bad Guy period in the decades since with a characteristic mixture of honesty and careful reticence. He has acknowledged that it was difficult. He has acknowledged that there was genuine tension within the band. He has described Freddie's solo project as something he came to understand as necessary, as something Freddie needed to do in order to know what he had with Queen, and that the doing of it ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the band's foundations. Brian May has spoken about the Mr. Bad Guy period with characteristic honesty and careful reticence. He has acknowledged that it was difficult, that there was genuine tension, and that he came to understand Freddie's solo project as something necessary, something Freddie needed to do in order to know what he had with Queen. Whether this understanding arrived in real time or in retrospect, he has never been entirely clear about. The ambiguity is probably honest. What was uncertain and difficult in 1984 became, in the light of Live Aid and A Kind of Magic and the Magic Tour, something that could be understood as a necessary passage rather than an existential threat. But the necessary passage was genuinely difficult while it was being passed through. Roger Taylor has said almost nothing about 1984 and early 1985. This is striking precisely because Roger Taylor is usually the most openly expressive of the three surviving members, the one most willing to name difficult things. His unusual reticence about this period is itself a form of evidence. John Deacon, characteristically, simply continued to show up the stabilizing presence who never made the crisis bigger by adding his own drama to it. What ultimately kept Queen together was not a conversation or a single moment of resolution. It was something more mundane and more durable. The practical reality that the four of them, performing together, were capable of something that none of them were capable of separately. Freddie had gone outside Queen to discover what was possible without the constraint. What he found was real and valuable and genuinely his own. And it was not enough. Not because Queen was better. Because the specific thing Queen could do that he could only do with Brian and Roger and John behind him was something he needed in a way nothing else could replace. He had almost left. He did not leave. And everything Queen made after Mr. Bad Guy carries the quality of work made by people who have chosen each other deliberately, who know what the alternative is, and who have decided that this irreplaceable, constrained, chosen thing is what they are here to do.